now I want to get on to the thorny subject of when a student pisses off his teacher. This sadly happened between Ron and Camperley, as Ron related to me. Camperley had promised that to Ron, "For you, my fees will never increase," because he was so impressed with Ron's playing ability. But unfortunately, Ron had the bad habit in Camperley's eyes of quite frequently talking about high fifths and maybe disagreeing with a musical point by saying, well, high fifths would play it like this, in discussion with Camperley. And Camperley would shout at Ron and say, "I don't care what high fifths would do." Again, highlighting perhaps Camperley's slight professional jealousy. By the way, I'm a great admirer of Camperley, one of my favourite violinists, so I don't mean to be too critical of him here in this video, but finally, Camperley did raise the lessons, finally had enough of Ron talking about high fifths and manoeuvred things so that the lessons finished. And Ron sort of felt regret about this. He kind of wished that he'd kept his mouth shut and that he could have continued a bit longer with Camperley, was the impression that I got. Even though Ron and Camperley remained friends, like I said, Ron would pop in frequently, would run errands for him, and even took care of him while he was in hospital. Because remember, Alfredo Camperley had no children of his own, so Ron was always there even after the lessons had finished. Continued to maintain that great respect for his old teacher. Now, a very similar thing played out between Ron and myself. Ron and I became more than just sort of teacher and student. The dynamic was deeper than that. I'd known Ron since I was 4 years old. We would go to concerts in London. He took me to see Perlman, Jack Liebeck, Victoria Mullova, and even locally in Milton Keynes, a Chloe Hanslip concert in the cathedral. We would go down to the Royal Academy of Music and look at the violins. We went for the BVMA event at the Royal Academy of Music for the British violin makers. We would exchange film interests. For example, Ron turned me on to Satyajit Ray, the Apu trilogy, and Pata Panchali. And I lent him my French films, the Marcel Pagnol stories, Jean de Floyd and Manon de Sauce. We'd talk a lot about the golden age of Hollywood and the classical beauties versus the sirens. So, for example, Audrey Hepburn and Sophia Loren, all the old movie stars. We would talk about travel in India, many things, a wide range of things. I would never turn up and just get straight into the lesson. I did in the very beginning, but very soon the routine would be, because I'd originally been with Ron for lessons when I was 4, and I went back to Ron when I was in my early 20s to resume lessons. So the routine would be that I would turn up at his house. Ron would always make me something to eat and a cup of coffee. And then we would start a conversation that would last a minimum of an hour. Finally, we'd get on to the lessons, and because I'd be going to Ron's after work, I would sometimes be a little bit tired and not always be able to give my best during the lesson. I was kind of knackered at that point, and sometimes I'd wish that maybe we could just get straight into the playing and then have the chats afterwards, but that just wasn't the way it was with Ron. One day, Ron took me upstairs. He wasn't very IT savvy, so I would help him get his PC set up. I'd even help him do things like decorate the outside of his house, hold the ladder while he was painting some woodwork. The kind of things that Ron would do for Camperley, sort of helping my teacher. And I see that high fitz students can be seen on video. In the few videos we have of high fitz of his home, in the background, sort of trimming high fitz and roses and things like that, getting his students involved in helping him out. So one day I was upstairs in Ron's house. I might have been helping him with his PC, and he might have been showing me his latest artwork that he was working on, which I can vividly still see in my mind. It was a portrait of a mixed race woman that he was painting. I think maybe an air hostess he'd seen on a flight. And then he started getting out some old pictures. And now, a little bit of background to Ron. He was from Goa, but from an Anglo-Indian family. So, and I think his mum was Catholic, and Goa at the time was being run by the Portuguese. So the family spoke Portuguese, they didn't speak Hindi. And they were much aligned to European culture. His dad was a Heifetz fan. His dad actually seen Heifetz live in concert. Ron almost got to, but unfortunately the concert in the 60s ended up being cancelled by Heifetz at short notice. It was a concert at the Royal Albert Hall. Ron had the ticket, but alas, it wasn't to be. Heifetz cancelled. But his dad had actually seen, and his uncle had actually seen Heifetz. They'd been educated in England. Ron was probably born around 1935, so still during the time that the Portuguese were there, the British Raj was there, and then living through the war as well, with the threat of Japanese attack on India, British forces stationed out there. And at this time, Ron would listen to the wireless, so to speak, and this is where he would, as a young boy, be listening to Heifetz, who would go on to be his lifelong idol. There we are upstairs, and Ron has pulled out some old photos of him. Now, bearing in mind everything I've said, Ron was kind of culturally European, but he totally looked Indian. I mean, if you saw him walking down the street, you'd think there's an Indian guy. However, he really distanced himself from the Indian culture. He would kind of mock it, really. Although there were some aspects of it that he liked, in general, he was in that classical mindset and didn't agree with the kind of the Indian culture and tried to distance himself from it. So he pulled out the old photos, and I'm looking at a photo. At this time, Ron had grey hair, but in the photo, he had jet black hair, and I couldn't see his face, and I didn't quite recognise him. So it was a picture of him in the orchestra, and stupidly, I said, "Who's that Bengali guy in the orchestra there?" And Ron looked at me, he started laughing, and he said, "It's me," and I started laughing as well. I think if I'd said, "Who's that Portuguese looking guy?" he might have been less offended. From that point, I noticed the difference. My fees went up, just like Camperley had put Ron's fees up when Ron kept on going on about Heifetz. And things are just a little more strained with Ron, and never quite the same, sadly, because I flapped my mouth and said something stupid, not intending to annoy him, but I guess his ego sort of kicked in. I was still in touch with Ron afterwards, and then he passed away in late 2009, I think on Boxing Day. I heard he actually passed away on the stage. He had a heart attack while doing some sort of Boxing Day concert, though I haven't confirmed that, but I heard that. So just like Camperley had edged Ron out because he kept going on about Heifetz during lessons, I got edged out because I mistook Ron for a Bengali guy when really he wanted to be identified as a Portuguese, Goan, European English guy. But unfortunately he looked completely Indian, so it just is what it is. And what I'm getting at here is this is just a note for all the teachers out there, especially the ones with the bigger egos, which sometimes just comes part and parcel with being a great player, that if your student makes a mistake, be a little bit patient and forgiving. That's just my message there.